Hi, we're back, and oh my goodness, like, don't adjust the like screen settings on whatever device that you're watching this on, and like it's probably an Apple device, so you can't do that because they just don't let you do things on your devices anymore. Um, but like, yeah, don't worry, like you totally have not like accidentally like stuck a magnet or like whatever to the back of like your device and like fucked it up. This lighting, these colors are correct, Mama. They are correct. We are getting artsy here because we are getting culture today. We're going to talk about a novel. We're going to talk about words and prose. We're going to talk about the Torrey Peters novel, Detransition, baby. Oh my goodness, I'm just fucking buzzing because I took a chance. I took a big chance and I ordered a couple smart lights, the like cheap version of like Wi-Fi LEDs off of Amazon that change colors. And so like the color pickups, I think I've heard that's the industry term, are like very subtle. So hopefully it like looks nice on your device because like when I'm squinting on my laptop, it looks cute, it looks subtle, and I like it. So obviously it'd be like crazier for like still photos and other situations where the cameras are like right close to things that I post on other platforms. But no, I'm just excited. I'm just excited. I'm just excited. Because I just feel like I look really good. Like I just look like the way I'm supposed to. I'm under like bisexual lighting. I just feel extra frosty. Um, wow. Not the energy I was expecting to bring into this video, let me tell you that much. Um, yes, so prose, novel, words, Detransition, baby, Torrey Peters. So, um, if you caught the Euphoria episode, so like ironic that this is the one that I'm starting this lighting with instead of Euphoria episode, you may remember that there was like a trigger word in that episode that I was like, oh goodness, where are we going with this? And that word was detransition because it's a sensitive word. And so like I heard a lot of like pre-release buzz about this book. And I know that like Torrey Peters has been kind of like known in some circles for like a bit. Like she's done some other stuff before this that I was not exposed to. Um, so like there's a lot of anticipation. And I was just like, oh goodness, right? Because the way that like social media and things like screws with your mind is that you're just like preemptively like trying to like suss out the discourse that's going to happen, and I'm like, oh goodness, the D word, that's big, that's a lot. um but what really like calmed me the fuck down is that like generally speaking discourse on social media is not generated by like prose and like novels and books that people actually have to read, unless it's like some weird like young adult like fiction drama or like I don't know, some like obscure literary shit that gets started and you're just like, why are these college professors yelling at each other about like tentacle porn on the internet? What's happening right now? So like, okay, yeah, no, that's absolutely not what cooled me the fuck out at all. No, it was actually Anna Valens, AC Valens on Twitter, ACVALENS, who writes for the Daily Dot, other places, does great work on sex work and like internet porn and internet expression stuff, Sesta Fosta, trans things, just super cool. Had posted the part that like I think is getting some traction and is somewhat famous, I guess now, about this metaphor about baby rampaging baby elephants as like a metaphor, I guess, largely for like the kind of like out of control lateral violence that gets perpetuated between trans women, and it struck a chord with me because lateral violence between trans women has been like the bane of my existence for the last 4 years. And so it's really great to see because, of course, Anna Valens also has a book that I have not read yet that I will read called Tumblr Porn that's about kind of that era of the internet and sexual expression on the internet and that culture. And she in her book does also get into like Kahlo culture, receipts culture, more kind of like fine-grained stuff about like how people get driven out of like online spaces and discarded without like a pathway back. Like there's just, it's just like the front end of what might somehow be twisted into like a restorative justice framework without the back end, without the reintegration without like mechanisms for reintegration. And so people lose life-saving mechanisms and whatnot because they're deemed to be problematic or troublesome or whatever, right? So already having a firm basis in her work and having seen some of like these excerpts from Detransition Baby that that she had posted through her Twitter, kind of like knowing the context of where she sits on a lot of things, I was like, okay, okay, I feel much safer picking this up. Not that I thought that this was going to be like a big like, oh no, kind of a thing, but it's just kind of like, you know, every once in a while there's like an op-ed in the like New York Times where a trans woman, you know, describes like, you know, the idea of getting a of getting bottom surgery as having like a perpetually like open wound or some other like terrible metaphor. So you always kind of like, you're girding yourself. You're kind of like, oh no. So I was like, you know what, no. And then like other trans gals that I know were starting to like pick it up and read it, and I was like, oh my goodness, are we gonna like have like a little informal book club and like all read this book at the same time, which like never happens for us for a lot of obvious reasons. And that's exactly what fucking happened. It happened. So it's a brilliant and frequently difficult book. That like, who knows how I would have approached this book, like getting to it any sooner. And this is what I find kind of just sort of like so fascinating about like a lot of things that arrive in my life when they do. And some of these things, like some of the comics that I've read like a long time ago, in like 2005 or whatever, when I picked up like The Invisibles and Promethea, it's just kind of like I went to those and I was like, something needs to change, honey. And I've heard that this comic will change you if you let it. And you know, here I am 15 years later, so like, yes, Grant Morrison, who's now an out non-binary icon, did their work. It does what it says on the tin, right? But more to the point, stuff like the comic SFSX, like, and I missed it in its original single issues because I got it like completely mixed up with another comic that's just called Sex that I read one issue of. I'm like, what is this? And I just like didn't open any more review PDFs of it, so like I didn't really know what SFSX was until like, what was it, summer, fall? I think it was through the summer. And then I picked up and I was like, Jesus Christ, this is about like so many different things that I'm dealing with, blah, blah, blah. And it really just hit me like a brick at the precise moment that I was ready for the themes and ideas that were in it. And of course, obviously, that also happened prior to that with Trans Girls Hit the Town. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm just starting to transition. And it's like, why aren't there comics about this side of transition? It's like, well, it's time for me to make my own comics because Emma Jane has reminded me that this is a thing that I can do. So like, this is just, it's just such a fascinating thing because it's just kind of like, you know, I'm skidding into the end of my first full year on HRT, right? So that's a journey. So like I can kind of, so again, like, and any, like, everybody who's like prominently featured in this comic has like been transitioning for a long time, or like they transitioned for a long time and then they detransitioned after that long time. But a lot of those perspectives are a lot like easier for me to metabolize and understand now, because like medical transition does change your perspective on a lot of things. It just truly does. But it's just like one of the things that just really struck me, and it took me like most of the novel to really put it all together, but just like the way that she writes and just like her tone and influences, because like I don't know how people will take this, but just sort of like, and it never descends to like his depths of like grit and darkness and just like what he is. But there is a certain influence, I think, or like adjacency, I guess, if it's not direct influence, of like Chuck Palahniuk going on here. Just because, like, especially like the New York trans scene and just kind of like just the spaces that are occupied and the ways that people kind of deal with those in kind of like darker and weirdly self-reflective ways, like having to go to so many funerals and just having like a black sense of humor about just going to a lot of funerals for trans women that are typically suicide, and kind of things like that, and some of the kind of like the ranty perspectives that some of the characters have on various things, and that kind of self-awareness. There's just like there's a little bit of a Palahniuk edge to it. It you know, it does feel kind of like you could say something to the effect of being post Invisible Monsters, um, about this novel in that sense. But there's also like, and this is, it's really fascinating how this develops, and what its presence sort of like is. But there's also like a residual kind of, I don't know again if influence or adjacency or whatever is the right term for it, but like there are like little bits and pieces of William Gibson's like Blue Ant trilogy in here, and that's kind of like, I think it's an informal title. It might be a little bit prissy of me to call it that, but it's like pattern recognition, zero history, and whatever the fuck the other third one is. But it's just kind of like the stuff that was like hyper contemporary and kind of like dealing with the bleeding edge of like what smartphones and drones and these things could do in like around like the late 2000s to the early 2010s. um, and so it's just interesting because of like the ways that she describes like using Google Voice very very early on in the novel, or like the way that like basically like a car chase using Uber plays out and this kind of stuff. Kind of reminds me of the ways that the Gibson was like approaching these types of technologies when they were like brand new. But of course, like these things are like part of our daily lives now, and they don't have that same kind of sheen. But it's just something in like Torrey Peters' perspective on like how she writes about tech, which I think is really interesting because like there's a fundamental like class difference in this novel between predominantly mostly white trans women of being either in the tech sector to some degree or just like perpetually in basic shitty service jobs or sex work, right? Because like this the stereotype, and she does talk a little bit about this in the novel, sort of. Um, and this had popped up on Twitter a little bit ago, and I made a comic of it all my own. It's just kind of like, are you a coder or a sex worker, right? Are like kind of the two stereotypical, like, what do you do if you're a trans woman? Like, what is your career path? And the exact quote in the novel is like, uh, I think it's like an esthetician, a prostitute, or a coder, I think, is like the three, like the maiden, mother, crone, like the triple goddess of that particular situation. Um, but so I just kind of find it fascinating because like she slides them out a little bit because like Amy is working more for like an ad agency type of a thing, for most of the book, or Ames, depending on what point in his her life you're talking about. And Reese is typically described as being a waitress. And so you kind of have that because when they're in a relationship, there's big money and class difference between the two of them, and a lot of class tensions there in that specific relationship. But that's also like what the like class tensions of trans women are in real life. Again, like mostly white trans women, I guess, but I don't think it's quite as like starkly specific as the novel kind of goes, because I think those divisions show up in a broader range. And so that's kind of interesting in kind of the way that she deploys tech throughout the novel, because like tech is a big like class division, and also like kind of enabling space for trans women. So it's really fascinating to kind of see that. And of course, there's like a lot of talk of like sex work, informal, formal, client side, provider side in it. So it's just kind of like the network of those three things, of there being like this post Palahniuk quality to it, where some of the things that happen or some of the attitudes the characters have you would trace to some of his novels, but like definitely just some of like the almost like high camp parody of like how like cis people try to navigate trans issues in the novel start to reach the like extreme high campiness of some of what happens in Invisible Monsters, particularly with like the parents who think that they have a dead gay son, but they actually have like a living trans daughter who has just disappeared off the face of the planet, right? And they just become like extreme P flag parents when they're completely um, dismissive of this person in life. And the situation in Detransition Baby is much more complicated and much funnier, honestly. But to see that, and to see that kind of lingering, like just the the way that tech is discussed, but also like the parts of like Ames's job, like the Amy Ames's job in advertising and stuff, does focus on tech, does focus on social media and these kinds of things. But also like Reese does have a job that's kind of like being almost a personal shopper, but just kind of like being more of like a handler for like celebrities, like shopping at up and coming designers. So like her job there is very much the kind of thing that like a Blue Ant trilogy heroine would have, right? Who would be kind of cool hunting or something, or having this ephemeral position within that world. So it'd have those two things, plus the way that she approaches sex and kink and sex work is just kind of like, for me, being like, oh, these are three things that I'm immersed in, that are like personally a me thing. But then I'm just like, is like, are all of these attributes like a we thing? Is this a very like generational trans woman thing? Is this a millennial trans woman thing? Like, is, you know, because like there are some things that are like, we have certain, you know, weird shared like internet experiences or like things like that, but something this kind of broad, like what literary influences are out there, and approaches to sex and kink all kind of coming together. It's like, is it just a coincidence that like these things are relevant in these particular ways to Torrey Peters and to Veronique Emma Houbois at the same time, or like is this something broader, right? Because these aren't necessarily, all three of them together are not things that I've ever thought were binding, you know, or that I found like connection and community in. I mean, like the kink and sex stuff and sex work intersections. I mean, like, yeah, fully. But like when you put all three of those broad aspects of the novel into play, I'm just like, are these all generational things for us too, or is it just a coincidence that that this is something that I share with the author? So I don't know. I don't know. I guess time will tell, maybe, or maybe it won't. Who knows? Um, but like, so that's like the end of like the spoiler free part of this video, because like the broad strokes of the novel, boy, and it's also told out of order. So like also kind of Palahniuk in that sense too, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people tell stories out of order, but who's pretty fucking famous for it? So like, for the most part, the primary viewpoint character is Reese, the trans woman, who is single, and she gets a phone call from her ex, who's going by Ames, who had identified as a trans woman and had lived as a trans woman for 6 years. And then, while the two of them were dating and living together, something happened that more or less precipitated Amy, as she was calling herself at the time, to detransition and go by Ames. And she was born James. So Reese gets a call from Ames, who is letting her know that Ames has accidentally gotten his girlfriend, who's also his boss at work, pregnant. And he thought that transitioning had rendered him sterile. I guess he was told that by an endocrinologist who should not have said that. Years and years and years ago. And of course, he had told Katrina not that he had transitioned and then detransitioned, but that he had had a vasectomy or something to that effect. And so he had to disclose his former trans status to her, and things were very fraught in terms of where the relationship and where this accidental pregnancy was going to go. And so the cisgender woman who was pregnant, named Katrina, who is his boss and who is a divorced woman, is pregnant with Ames's baby. And so Ames calls Katrina Reese, because he has this wild idea that the three of them can co-parent, because Reese had for a very long time been very serious about wanting to have a child of her own in some way. And they had, when Ames was Amy and Reese had almost adopted a foster child together, right? And thus begins this wild attempt for these very three different people to try to come together and figure out whether they want to attempt some kind of like a co-parenting situation and what that would look like. And so through the chapters are split between months after conception of the child, moving forward in time, and years leading up to it, telling the story of, effectively, among other things, focusing on the relationship between Reese and Amy and its disillusion, and then into how Katrina and Reese and Amy come together and come apart and come together and come apart in what's effectively the present tense of the novel. And so it's just kind of like, I mean, the fact, like I said, like the D word is a big word. It does grapple with a lot of big things and a lot of like super intimate intra-community trans things in the book. So I think in a lot of ways, you know, having processed the Jules episode, the special Jules episode of Euphoria, maybe like a week, probably less than that, before starting this novel was like useful and good and like a good primer, because it was kind of like watching that and being like, are these things that I really want, like the wider world and like the wider cis world to just enter into, and get a front row seat to, and so like there's a lot of that stuff in this book, and so it's always kind of like just appreciating getting to see like difficult fiction that grapples with these things and like makes me feel seen and heard and understood and like allegorized in ways that I've never seen. It's a very intense experience and it's very good, but you're also just kind of like, who else is reading this? Who else has access to this? And it's just very because especially because like we're past like I guess what's been called like the transgender tipping point, or like we're in the realm of like hypervisibility. Um, and it's important always to note in the realm of this hypervisibility. And this is something that Black trans activists have said before, that like the age of like hypervisibility has told our enemies where we live, right? And when she said that, she was talking about just like just the constant unabated like rate of murder, really effectively, yeah, of Black trans women, and that it just doesn't stop, right? And like, how do you reconcile more public education, more public visibility, with the fact that there's still this epidemic of violence? And it's kind of like, well, people know, like, there are, it can effectively be a consequence, a part of that, and what hypervisibility has done in the United Kingdom, and lured out some of the most vociferously anti-trans voices in media. So like, there are consequences, there are bad consequences to hypervisibility. It's not all, yay, we watched this culture documentary, now it's like easier to get funding for like trans projects, or like maybe we can have conversations we couldn't have before. That's true, right? There is like a positive Harvey Milk aspect to it, where he was like, we need people to come out, to take that risk, so then the average person can say, oh well, yes, I know a gay person, right? And create a personal connection to the issue, right? But those dynamics are not the same for trans people, and they're not the same in like 2020, 2021, where we are. So like, it can be difficult to kind of be like, well, and to feel kind of like, well, do we want to see, do we want to feel this exposed? Do we want to get this exposed? Do we want it to be this easily out there and gotten in our inner community lives, open to like dissection and like access from the outside world? And I mean, that's been a raging debate about, and like, that's also a very racialized debate about the ethics of the production of, Paris is Burning for a very fucking long time. So the contours of that like balance between like getting to see representations of ourselves and like the outside world, being invited into some of our most intimate spaces, is something that we've been dealing with, different parts of the community, but largely the whole in different ways, have been grappling with for like 30 years, if you want to go back to when Jen Livingston shot Paris is Burning, but like definitely the last like 10 years, right? And it's wild to think that this like the hypervisibility era, or like the transgender tipping point, that we're kind of like really edging into a decade of it. I don't know exactly when it is that you want to say that it started, but it's roughly a decade now, I think, that we're this deep into it. And I really don't think that, like, I haven't really read any interviews or anything with Torrey Peters, because like, a lot of times I just want to go into these things and I don't want to know too much about what anybody else thinks of it. I don't want to get brain poisoned, and I don't want to know too much about what the author intended and what the author did and saw in all of this before I get to it. I kind of do want to be able to just have my own, like, what the fuck is it that I think of this, before like all the other stuff gets in. But like, my evaluation of the book is that like Torrey Peters knew what she was doing, or at least what she was intending, and then she like very clearly understood the dynamics of like who was potentially going to be in the audience for this, right? Because I'm sure that we know that like, as a percentage, not like raw numbers, because like there's just not that many of us out there, that like this is a book that, like I said, like a lot of the trans girls that I know are buying and reading and talking about it, like at I don't know, probably like an 80 or 90%, right? Relative to people who I've not seen a single cis person mention it. I mean, like, there's cis writers who are quoted as having read it, like Party, but just kind of like socially. I haven't seen anybody who is not a trans woman mention this book so far. And that isn't to say that my social circles are that narrow. They're not. And it's no judgment, but I'm just saying, like, this is where the percentage of the audience are going to skew, but there's still people who are not trans who are going to read this. Like, it's out there for them. But I think Torrey Peters makes it very clear, not through, I guess, kind of through the proxy of her authorial voice throughout the novel, that she's very aware of this concept, right? Because the opening kind of dedication, which is something that, like, Reese reiterates almost word for word later in the novel, and, like, it goes through a couple different iterations throughout the novel, but the opening dedication is to divorced cis women who, like me, had to face starting their life over without either reinvesting in the illusions from the past or growing bitter about the future, right? So she's, just from the very beginning, before the novel even starts, she's, like, trying to create a space for shared identity, shared experiences, and solidarity between cis and trans women, right? That she's reaching out to say, like, this is a category of woman, of cis woman specifically, that I feel like I can identify with, that I have some basis of, like, identification with. And it's just kind of like, I started transitioning at 36. So I immediately was like, honey, I get it. Like, I get what it is that you're implying here and what you're saying. I've never been through a divorce. I've never been married. But it's just kind of like the sort of stock narratives that we use to describe divorced cisgender women and the things that they do in that space, while they feel that their identity is in large part dominated by the fact of that divorce and what it does to change their life circumstances. Because, of course, like a lot of people who transition, particularly in the millennial and Gen X generation, do also go through divorces at the same time, right? There's a notable intersection there, but that's also why Peters goes out of her way to say divorce cisgender women, because it's a specific experience, right? So she's trying to create a basis, like a pathway to say, to put the vulnerability of opening up so many of our generational experiences and our, like, I don't even know exactly how to phrase all of it, but just like the intimate details of, like, our transness and our intercommunity dynamics, like to create a basis of an inroad, like of a purpose for it, other than just, like, voyeurism, right? Or, like, go on a trans safari through a novel, right? Like, she's setting them up to be like, this can be a basis of, like I said, shared experience, shared identity, and solidarity. Because, of course, that's throughout the novel, and it takes quite a long time for this to sort of really develop. A lot of that is what gets hashed out between Reese and Katrina, and there's just, like, long stretches of the book in which Ames just kind of disappears, because, I mean, that's just kind of like what his situation and perspective through a lot of this is, but also to kind of seed the stage to kind of, like, to talk through the messiness of, like, cis and trans women navigating each other in a non-romantic, non-sexual context of like trying to suss out what it is motherhood has been sold to them as those two distinctive categories of woman, and what it is that they want out of that category, out of motherhood as those two distinctive things, right? And so I don't necessarily, like, love is my favorite thing. These parts of the novel, sometimes they do have the contours of, like, a Tumblr debate of, it's like, well, this is, how this is how I'm looked at and whatnot in terms of seeking motherhood as a trans woman. And it's like, well, as a biracial Asian woman, this is how, you know, and they kind of get into these, you know, it's never oppression Olympics, but it kind of, and I'm like, sure, they're awkward, they're weird, they're not entertaining to read, they do feel like things you've seen on the internet before, but it's just kind of, I'm just kind of like, I understand the utility here, like I do. Um, because like some of it just really feels to me as like reiterated like passages out of the readings that I've done in like my undergrad women's studies classes, right? And I think that's fascinating because of course like I have some college, I don't have like a paper, I don't have like a degree or diploma. So like the type of jobs I can get, the class contours that I have are like very much mapped onto Reese. Um, but of course, she hasn't really had any of those and like gone through a lot of that other side of the conversation that like Katrina, having gone through college and obviously having like a very different upbringing from a lot of the like the experiences of media and whatnot that would inform Reese's perspective on these things have happened. So it's kind of like a weird middle space for me to spectate those scenes in. But the ultimate thing is that there is an attempt here to create a space of talking through these interactions between trans women and cis women to get through those weird reservations and those weird resentments to kind of build a pathway kind of forward. And like fiction can be very good at having a lot of these conversations for us, or like giving us pictures of what these conversations can look like so that we don't have to blunder like just fully fucking through them in awful ways in real life. You know, it's just kind of, you just read this book, okay, it's fun, it's a novel, there's candy, there's dessert in it too, right? Instead of just being like, hi, read Gender Trouble, right? But it's fiction, because fiction can be like a simulator for things, right? And I think a lot of it, like a lot of emphasis, especially on the way that we talk about fiction right now, is almost like a morality simulator. It's either things are like transgressive, and you know, and what does it mean if we consume things that are transgressive, or they're like grand moral teachers. Like this is what the cartoon with like the two like female gendered rocks kissing tells us, right? Like, um, and then that whole world is just so black and white to the point of being useless, and then spawning the neo-Puritan movement that we see like blowing up all over social media. And so Torrey Peters has really reminded us that the ways that we simulate these conversations about our values and our identities can occupy spaces outside of that. That they can bridge gaps, you know, that they can breach the barriers between like just pure fiction, just pure, I don't want to say escapist, but like things that are not meant to map directly onto our lives, and things that are very like didactically moral teaching endeavors, right? That those kind of spaces can exist, but it's also like throughout the novel. And again, like, you know, Reese being a like primary viewpoint character for most of the novel does mean that you get so much more of like a direct trans experience through the novel, and so like cis readers are like seeing things through her eyes. And again, like I'm saying, it's an opening of a pathway there. But at the same time, you know, she articulates the ways that she feels exposed or uncomfortable in the ways in which Katrina particularly is taking in this information, and what she's being allowed into, and what like intra-community like dynamics and things it is that she's getting to see. Because like early on in the novel, you're seeing more of Ames doing this, and you're just kind of like, Ames's positionality is just so incredibly fraught, because Ames has detransitioned and now identifies as, I guess, a cisgender man again. Um, and is telling Katrina things about like intra-community dynamics between trans women, and it's just kind of like, are you really in a position from back on the outside to be the one to be saying all of these things about the ways that we interact with each other when you're now again on the outside. And then that's where the baby elephant thing happens, where like these juvenile elephants that go on rampages because effectively their parents and whatnot have been all murdered by poachers, so they grow up like fucking feral, having no idea how to bond and socialize, so they just fucking go on rampages and destroy all kinds of things. And it's an incredibly like intense and correct metaphor for just kind of like a lot of the ways that kind of like community and selfhood and whatnot get denied to trans women, who then lash out at each other in spectacularly terrible ways in adulthood, thus further destroying, opportunities for community and whatnot. And that gets back to what I was saying about Anna Valens and her book Tumblr Porn, and like call out culture and like receipts culture and all of that shit of like holding people's past transgressions over their heads without giving them any kind of opportunity for like reintegration or like rehabilitation or any of like that other side of like transformative restorative justice. It's just all of the punitive carceral thinking with none of like the genuinely needed reconciliation and reintegration that's meant to come with transformative and restorative justice. And so like that whole thing, and it is one of the most brilliant parts of the book, and that's again like one of those sort of like mapping like a nature documentary thing onto human behavior that kind of feels a little Palahniuk, although I don't know that Palahniuk ever came out with anything quite as profoundly like productive, out of it, as opposed to just kind of almost pure animalistic nihilism typically. But that's just different styles of writing, different, intense. But the entire framing of that is this is Ames describing like trans community dynamics to Katrina. And it's just like, oh, so the context of this particularly fraught part of the novel is someone who detransitioned telling it to their cisgender female partner. And it's just like, yikes, wow, I don't know how I feel about this at all. But that's the point, right? Because those types of things where it's like, what is Ames's positionality, right? And what can and should be disclosed when about just like our own inner workings play out a lot between like recent Ames and other situations as the novel plays out. And so it's just kind of like, it's nice to see, particularly through Reese, where I'm just kind of like, I don't fucking know about this, or like I feel extremely fucking exposed about this. And it's never like necessarily exactly in those moments, but it's like, like just the context of maybe the baby elephant scenario will come home later, because there's like this scene late in the book where like Reese has this kind of like reaction to Ames suggesting a book on lesbian parents to Katrina, to try to get a sense of understanding where Reese is going to come through, because this book of course talks about situations where there's two mothers. One is the birth mother, the other one is not, and kind of trying to deal with like the psychology of being the non-birth mother in that couple as being the closest analog for how Reese will fit into this scenario, with Katrina being the cisgender birth mother. And she's just looking at this book and she's just like, is this something that like I'm comfortable with Ames giving to Katrina that's supposed to like kind of psychoanalyze me, or like help her navigate me psychologically, and of course she's like picking out in her head all of the ways that like that those don't map, because of course these are cisgender lesbian couples that like this book was like written to be for and about, and that is not her. And so it's all like, and so whether or not the specifics of that book and that situation are like immediately relatable, it does bring back my own headspace, say for like the juvenile baby elephant story, because that to me, because I don't have particularly strong views on like motherhood or desire to mother children of my own. That's just not me. So I don't necessarily like identify with Reese on any level in what she goes through, which again is great, but it's just kind of like getting to see that level of exposure and feeling exposed in that way reflected in her headspace in the book is like, yes, Torrey Peters understands. Well, I mean, like, of course she would, but she's like, she's putting that there. Reese's, this combobulation there for a reason, because like for the trans women reading it, it's like, yes, this is how I feel reading your fucking novel, Torrey. This is how I feel about every second fucking chapter of your book, of just feeling so like, just so ridiculously exposed and being like, oh my god, the cis has access to this, right? And I say that in jest, but like also as like a chin check, I think, and like I'm not cis, so like I don't know how cis people are gonna read this, and again, like I've heard zero other than like the back page quotes, like I've heard zero cis opinions of this novel or how they read through it. So who knows? Maybe I will find that out one day. But it's just kind of, but it could also function as a chin check to like a cis readership who could be like, oh, right, this is probably how trans people feel about me reading this book, right? Is that the way that Reese feels about Katrina reading the lesbian parenting book is the way that trans people feel about me, a cisgender person, reading Detransition Baby. And so that is just the brilliant complexity of this book, and just how it takes so much raw, visceral, difficult emotion and just weaves that into an understanding of what the book wants for an objective, right? Because I mean, a novel is a novel. It doesn't have to have a grand plan in society, but it's quite clear that there is an objective here, and it's a worthy objective, and I'm here for it, is to try to build more of a sense of shared, experience and solidarity between cisgender women and trans women, and I applaud Torrey Peters for doing it and for working that into a novel that shouldn't need to have an agenda like that to exist, but I'm glad that it's there, and I'm glad that it's her doing the work, because I don't want to do that. I just feel that in the particular field that I'm in, which is to say the comic book industry, is that I have just been subjected to just repeated failures and abandonment by white feminism, that I just don't care to do that fucking work, right? I don't want to open up my viewpoint on the world and my perspectives and my experiences to the level of like a vulnerable state to try to build that specific like linkage, because like I feel like a lot of people have done that, and I just feel like a lot of my time has been wasted by well-meaning white feminists who want to do things about gender imbalances in our particular field, but don't have the follow through. I've been to a lot of tea parties, let's say, where there's a lot of big talk and no follow through. So I don't feel like I want to be the one to be extending that olive branch. So I'm glad that Torrey Peters does it, because like the thing is that she's not the first trans woman through fiction or like autobiography or anything else to open up a space of extreme vulnerability that is either geared towards or is capable of extending an olive branch to cisgender women to like create a shared sense of identity and experiences which will hopefully breed solidarity. It's not the first time this has happened. This is a particularly brilliant way of doing it. But the problem is, like, of course, like, the power and privilege of these things, right? And, of course, like, it's not a nullifier, but it's like a complicator, is of course, that Katrina is biracial. She's mixed race. She's Asian. And so that complicates a lot of what Reese thinks are very, like, neat narratives about life. And when there's, like, not really anything neat about her own life anyway, but it's just kind of like Katrina's worldview complicates hers, and in ways that need complicating, right? So it's not quite exactly the same. It's a bit more non-Euclidean, let's say. But generally speaking, you know, where the power and the privilege and the vulnerability and the opportunities for exploitation thereof between cis and trans women, it's pretty clear where that is. And so it's just kind of like we are always the ones making ourselves vulnerable, and we're always the ones that they're reaching out to say, you know, here's the basis that we can use for like shared experience and solidarity. And you don't really see very much in the other direction. You know, I mean, I can see two fictional spaces in comics, you know, that have been created by cisgender women that have opened up that pathway on the other side, and they are Bitch Planet, which can you see it? You can see it, which I have a tattoo of, and SFSX. Those are the two. And Bitch Planet ships it like an issue every 5 years, and that's fine, whatever. But it's just kind of like the level of like who's reaching out and from what spaces they're reaching out from is kind of instructive of like how people view us. Like, it's one thing to say like trans women are women, but it's just like, are you going to introduce conceptions of womanhood into your fiction that are particularly geared towards bringing us into it in ways that we have equity? I would say that Kelly Sue DeConnick and Tina Horn have done that. I would say nobody else has that I've witnessed. So it's kind of a situation where it's kind of like people can say that they're supportive, people can say that they want to believe in this basic math equation, but it's kind of like, but we aren't present in your worlds. So what does that say? You know, or if when we're present in your worlds, it's to teach other cisgender people about us, to tell them our histories, or to tell them your interpretation of how we see ourselves or don't want to see ourselves. And so it's a conversation about us and not a conversation with us. And this is kind of the thing that I'm saying about what happens here, about Torrey Peters welcoming, I don't know if welcoming is the right word, but like bringing the potential for a cisgender audience into our spaces. But at every step of the way, they're mediated by trans women, typically, or Ames, who is a former trans woman for, you know, a certain stretch of the novel. But, you know, like, those dynamics are not the same, and it's kind of like, how do we build on that? Where do we go with that? And that's just So that's why I don't do that. Why I that's not the objective of solidarity and shared experience in my work. It's like I'm super happy to have cisgender women, read my comics and to find those things there. I think I write in a certain way that I cartoon in a certain way that opens up my views of sex and gender and womanhood and various things for broad basis of people to find either themselves or a reflection of things that they understand and can build from in it. Um, but I kind of see who my fan base is. I see where I get the biggest reactions from, right? And so that's why I talk a lot about really kind of trying to nurture a better kind of understanding and relationship with non-binary people because they have been the biggest champions of my work. And I'm kind of just more focused on what I guess I'm calling the symbiotic relationship between trans women and cisgender men. And cisgender men is kind of in quotation marks there because that's not necessarily a permanent state, right? And it's a fairly well-known fact that I'm not a big fan of chaser language. And I think I'm not a big fan of using chaser language in mixed company, right? Let's put it that way. That's the easiest way to put it. And one of the reasons why I'm opposed to the use of chaser language in mixed company is because there is not there's not much of a broad consensus about what that word means or who it applies to. Because a lot of times it just gets used as a broad spectrum term for any presumably cisgender man who is sexually interested in trans women. And even in intra-trans conversations, sometimes that just sort of is what it is. And sometimes it's a more predatory construction or a more fetishistic construction. These contexts change depending on where you are, who you're talking to, and what it is that you're talking about specifically. There's a lot of drift, a lot of change in how people view that language and how they use it. And I think it's just so fascinating because there's a very unique taxonomy of chaser that Torrey Peters describes in this novel, and kind of how she traces out what that relationship is to trans women. Because at one point Reese is talking about how a lot of her early relationships with men, she wasn't trying to find them on Grindr or more above board mainstream ways of finding men. She was searching on more fetishy type sites. They would use sissy terminology or or slurs and whatnot. And to her perspective was that she wanted to date men that she already knew what the terms were, what their interests were, that they could handle being with a trans woman, that's what they were after, because she didn't want to go through trying to coach some vanilla cis boy through how to deal with a girl with a cock, right? And you kind of see this, you kind of see why it developed that way out of one of her early relationships that gets described in the novel. And so there's just kind of this, again, this is why I say symbiotic relationship, where she's well, she's well, I want relationships where it's kind of they know the score. And so of course she also ends up in a lot of relationships with married men cheating on their wives with her, who, again, like at that point, she also knows the score of they are not going to hold her hand in public, and it's kind of like there's a double layer to that. There is the trans misogyny of it, there is the trans panic element of it, but there's also just like that knowledge that, of course, with this particular guy, even if the girl that they were with was cis, they would be doing probably the same thing because they're cheating on their wife and they don't want to be seen with a mistress. So like there's kind of a weird layer of comfort involved in that, right? And so that's a lot, honey. That is a lot to process. There is so much to process in this fucking book. But the other thing, and this is something that I've been thinking more and more about, and kind of like why I dislike, kind of mixed company usage, like just open public usage of the term, is because your average like cis person just uses that as just like a pejorative to like stigmatize all attraction to trans women, like these kind of intra community nuances of how we might use the word just get fucking flattened and demolished into nothing as soon as your average cis person gets a hold of it. Because of course, like again, the like sexual jealousy of like cis women towards trans women is fucking bonkers and ugly and violent. And I'm sure that there's kind of like a not all cis women, and it's like, sure, honey, like that's functionally true, but it kind of works the same way with like the whole not all men. It's just kind of like, yes, this is a very common thing, and this is something that gets talked about in the book, and it doesn't, it's not exactly like she doesn't, like Torrey Peters doesn't get directly into the like what I call the sexual jealousy of cis women towards trans women, but like there's scenarios in the book where it's like that's what's happening, that's what's happening, but there is this kind of like there is a lot of, especially from Reese's point of view, where she does kind of talk about the like the resentments and weird hang-ups that cis women have towards trans women. And like we don't ever like it's not something that we really see cis women work through publicly or like actually talk about. And there have been like a lot of like games of chicken and like not exactly call outs, but kind of like we know that you go through these like thought processes about us, and we would like you to be more honest about the fact that you struggle with these things that you think about us, because for you to get over them and through them, you have to acknowledge them. And it's like, we know that you're going through it, and you're kind of like, ooh, this like trans exclusionary radical feminist viewpoint on trans women almost feels right, and I feel terrible and bad about myself and naughty for like kind of believing this. But it's like, we need to see you work through that. We're not going to trust you otherwise. And that's maybe a little bit too much of a maximalist position, but it's just kind of like, we need you to acknowledge that you've gone through this. We don't want to just see the trans women or women like sloganeering, because we can pick out the real ones from the not real ones, right? And something that Torrey Peters does talk about is like the rare like cis woman who's just like been around, been in the game. She's like pretty much like an honorary trans woman, because she's like earned her like merit badges, and I have like a close friend that I consider personally to have done her merit badges. But I don't know if I would go around saying, well, this is that girl, right? I mean, whatever. Like I don't feel like it's my job to just say, yeah, like she's that one. But I mean, like, and this is not the friend I'm talking about, because we're not friends. I don't know her, but it's just like the energy that like Torrey Peters describes in the novel of just like that type of this girl. It's like Tina Horn. It's like Tina Horn. It's that's the kind of person that she's describing. And it's just kind of like, it's hard for us to kind of like figure out to what degree we can trust you, if you're not giving us anything more publicly than just kind of like the trans woman or women spiel, we need to see a little bit more, right? Um, and part of that can just be being frank about like the things that you've thought about us over time that were just like not good. Because like, honey, how many things do you think that we've thought about ourselves? And by ourselves, I mean like shit that we've had to work through about trans women that we believed either before we identified as trans women or like internalized ugly shit that we had to work through and like not take out on each other. Like, there's nothing that you can do to me that I haven't already done to myself, to quote the mindless self-indulgence song. Like, that's what I'm saying. It's just kind of like, just like, please admit that you've gone through these stages with us, right? And so, like, the whole, like, taxonomy of, like, the chaser thing extends into something that, like, this is what I've been saying, is that, like, that whole, like, sexual jealousy and a lot of these kind of, like, weird hang-ups that cis women can have towards trans women that just drive the public usage of that term, that concept. Because like I've written about this before, Cardi B got in trouble a few years ago for like just a bad video, just a bad video that she made. That she's like, oh, if you want to get back at a guy for like cheating on you or whatever, you like you get him drunk and you tell him you're going to have a threesome and you invite a trans woman. And it's like, okay, so what it like? Then thank you. Thank you. I know exactly what you've done there, and it's terrible. It's terrible. Don't ever do that. And by do that, I mean like don't talk about that. Don't bring that up. But it's just kind of like just the underlying thoughts of what that means to fuck us, right? It's just like if you really want to get him back, leave him with the shame of fucking a trans woman. It's like, wow, honey, like, wow, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm not gonna get into like, do we cancel Cardi B for that? Do we not? Because she's like really tight with Tokyo, and Tokyo's making tons of money doing shit for her. I don't know. Fuck it, whatever. I love Cardi. You just have to put up with shit. Like, you just have to decide if you put up with shit or don't. But it's just kind of like those kind of hang-ups, like, are just so central to why like chaser language in mixed company and in public is just like no, because those are the thought processes that dominate how the wider world views that. It just fucking is. And so like in a novel like this, obviously like she has the space to explain kind of like how the characters use the term. And like again I said, there's kind of a taxonomy of it. And one of them is what she calls crypto trans. And she gets a lot deeper into this than like my thought process on it had been, but like one thing that I super don't like about the use of that term and the designation of it is that it does a lot of times get used on trans women who just like aren't out yet. And like I've talked to trans women who dated other trans women before they were out, and had to deal with like with the attitudes that cis men get for being attracted to us, and like those reactions from like cis women because they're also into trans women. And so like the level of damage that does to someone having to deal with that shit on their way to coming out as trans themselves is fucking awful, and is enough of a reason to kind of, I think, really sort of reevaluate the ways in which we allow that term to circulate in mixed company outside of trans circles. I think that's a big bad thing. But like I guess it's what Reese says. It's not necessarily what Torrey Peters believes, but it's what Reese says in the novel. Is there's like a taxonomy, and like the thing she describes is what she calls crypto trans, where it's a certain type of person, presumed to be a cisgender man, who disassociates, in very disconcerting ways during sex. And it's just kind of like they're probably like, that's why she calls it crypto trans, because they are trans, they can't handle it yet, and it just has this energy to it that's not good, that's really bad. And so that really kind of like, that wasn't a full piece of that puzzle that I was thinking through, but like afterwards I'm like, yeah, that's just creating even more baggage, right? When that kind of loose talk happens, and so it's just kind of like yeah, like that happens, like the people, who just get tagged with those stigmas and those shames. Some of them are trans themselves, right? Might come out, might not, who knows? But it's just kind of like, it's like straight guys who are into trans women, like they're not queer, they're straight guys, but there's just this like this outer membrane of just like, we have to figure out how to deal with you, and we have to figure out how to like get through that baggage, because like, we don't want you hiding us, we don't want you abusing us, we don't want you killing us, right? And people have agency over the stigmas, right? Like they truly do. So you can't just say, oh well, it's okay that he won't hold my hand in public because it's the stigma talking. No, honey. Like I've mentioned this before. There's like there's levels to this. There's positionality to this between trans women and cis men. And it's just like, yes, I recognize that this is difficult to you, and that there are like social costs to being that open with us. But the costs are much higher for us. Please understand the differential and make more of a concerted effort, you know? So like those parts of the book are more interesting to me, because it's like, I say this again and again and again, my like interest in men is very, very limited. So like, I don't identify with anything in the relationships that Reese has with men. Like those are the two things about her that I'm just like, this is opaque to me. Well, it's not really opaque because I can see it, on the page, but it's just like, I don't identify with this. I'm just going to nod and continue. And it's like I said about, Jules in the Euphoria episode, that there's a lot of greatness now to being able to experience trans narratives that diverge from our experiences and allow us more more intimate connections with like a broader aspect of our own community and our own selves. Like, it can't just be me, 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 me. I want my specific transness reflected in the things that I see. Like, let's experience other people's transness. Let's open up the field, and let's allow that difference in when we are consuming these things ourselves, right? But it's like, I understand the things that like are difficult for her a lot, and kind of like the types of mental gymnastics and like the bad things that she has to deal with in order to like move through these spaces and seek these things out. And so it's just kind of like that, like those parts of the novel, and Reese in particular, are more compelling to me than Reese's relationship with Katrina. And and kind of finding this like shared perspective on motherhood that could, could potentially become a co-parenting situation for them, that they find this shared experience. I mean, it's great, it's fantastic, like I said, it's necessary. It's a feminist project worth pursuing. But where I envision like my life's work in terms of like activism and like what I put into my fiction and things like this, is the symbiotic relationship between cisgender men and trans women. Like that's where I see that I can do the work, where I can achieve things, where I think the work is necessary and I want to do it. Not necessarily do them, but I want to do it. Um, you know, like that's just the more compelling end of that spectrum. And I do really like the way that the novel gives us so much of a holistic perspective on those different things, because like if those relationship and community dynamics are more important to you, you have that. If the other part of it, the parts between like Reese and Katrina are more important to you, you have that. But also, if you don't know yet and you do feel like, and I mean it doesn't have to be that stark, it doesn't have to be that clean, but it does kind of feel to me that like particularly because of the dedication at the beginning of the book, that like Torrey Peters feels like it's more of a mission for her as a novelist to build on that dynamic and that relationship and that side of things. And so for me, so it's very clarifying, you know, because if you don't, and you can look at both things, right? You can divide yourself or you can choose neither. But I do think there's like a clarifying path to it, because she shows us these two distinctive worlds that Reese occupies that are fundamentally in tension for a lot of reasons, but it's just kind of like, to me, being like, ah, yes, this to me is where the work is, as opposed to this is where the work could be elsewhere. And so it just has the opportunity to open up conversations for you and just kind of like confirm things, you know, either way, where it's like, yes, this is something that I feel strongly about, or like, no, this is something that I don't feel strongly about. And it allows you to, again, like fiction is a simulator, you can have these conversations, you can go through these things and all of that. And it's also just like, it's a very emotionally difficult novel to consume as a very isolated trans woman in her first year of transition in a global pandemic, who never had access to like the types of community spaces and things that like you get in New York, you know. So there's just kind of like a nostalgia or like just a mourning for something that you never had, that just doesn't even really exist out there now. And like that's something that I've talked a lot about when it comes to SFSX and like kink spaces. And SFSX takes place in San Francisco, of course, but like a lot of the stuff that gets talked about in the comic is also informed by Tina Horn's experiences in New York, which she has also lived in. And of course her podcast and stuff talks a lot about stuff in New York, and there's spaces and experiences and things that actually overlap between Detransition Baby and SFSX. So it's just kind of like, yeah, like it can be like an extremely difficult emotional journey, but like good difficult. And it's just such a vacation from what it's like to be a millennial trans woman on the internet who came up through and will always be inextricably tied to like fandom spaces and certain types of like discourse to come out of it, because like this book, it knows they're out there, it discusses that kind of thing in brief, but it's a novel that like can't belong to those spaces and can't appear in those spaces, and takes what it is to places that they can't follow. And it's very nice to go to a place that can't follow, to feel like I'm in the type of space that I want to inhabit, that's so far away from the one that I'm in. Just even from like a psychological, ideological, and just lived experience standpoint, right? And that's worth the cost of that, I think, emotionally. But there's just like there's such a dark irony to like an early concept that gets introduced in the novel, and it kind of comes back later, is that Reese has what's called this idea of the Sex and the City dilemma, or her extrapolation on the Sex and the City dilemma. And it's funny because, like, until a couple months ago, I had never watched a single episode of that show. Like, I knew that the broad outlines of the show, but I was just like, it's not really for me. And maybe I'll do another video or a podcast about how I feel about Sex and the City someday. But it's just kind of like, I'm a couple seasons in, so I have, like, a much stronger perspective on the dynamics of it. And so Reese is talking about how, like, you have the main characters. You have Charlotte. Carrie, Charlotte, Samantha. Fuck. Carrie, Charlotte, Samantha. What the fuck is the other one's name? Is that? God damn it. Anyway, there's 4 different ones. Carrie, Samantha, Charlotte. I guess that tells you, like, what my perspective on that show is. That this is probably already answering, like, you know, and that they have 4 different responses to kind of, like, womanhood, right? Like contemporary womanhood, whether it's like trying to seek out the, like, normative kind of, like, yuppie existence, trying to be completely independent on your own, whatever the fuck it is Samantha is. I can't remember exactly how she frames Samantha, or, like, dedicate yourself to the arts as Carrie, you know, like, as a writer or what have you. And so obviously the one that I remember that I can just, like, quote from memory is Carrie, because I'm a Carrie. But there's kind of, like, these 4 things, right? These 4 different responses. And so, like, Reese is saying that, like, millennial trans women are kind of like the first generation that have been able to get out of, like, a sense of zero futurity to start to try to actually try to solve that question for ourselves, to have those 4 choices. And of course she says this because, like, when the dissolution of her relationship with Amy, who later becomes Ames, happens, they were on the cusp of having a child, right? And so she kind of was that one of the group that she was pursuing motherhood. Like, that was kind of like her solution to it. But, like, I'm reading this in January, like, I read it through January and, like, finished a few days ago, of 2021. And again, like, zero futurity, right? Like this mixing of Sex and the City language with, like, William Gibson, Blue Ant trilogy type terminology. This is what I'm saying about, like, this is just feeling so, like, stunned by just, like, the things that I thought were just, like, incidental me things are maybe resolving themselves into, like, a generational identity, like something that feels much bigger and diasporic. You know, things like a me thing is a we thing. It's like, wow. And not things that I, you know, came into kind of being like, these are we things, like watching Drag Race and having opinions about Drag Race and making fun of RuPaul and the train flag incident, right? Things that, you know, are shared experiences from the jump. But it's just, but she was talking about this idea of, like, overcoming this sense of zero futurity, to have, like, to be able to start to resolve, to graduate into having that problem, the Sex and the City dilemma of which of the 4 pathways you want to choose. But reading that in January and February of 2021 is that I feel like that's disappeared for me, that I'm back to zero futurity. And I guess, like, if there, you know, my solution, my answer to the choice, to the Sex and City choice, is Carrie, is dedication to the arts. I think that's very, very obvious about me. But I just, you know, and she's like, we finally, generationally, or at least enough of us, have generationally reached a point where we can overcome zero futurity to be able to have an answer to that question. I'm just like, I feel like zero futurity is taking over again. And like that's a fucked up thing to say, but here we are. And so it's such a weird space um, to read that novel in, because again, like I said, it's a very intense and difficult emotional journey, but it kind of leaves you, at least sort of like conceptually, in the way that it talks about the broader community and trans identity and what we can be and where we can go, is cautiously optimistic, and it takes very much the like perspective of like take the leap into the void, because we have to build, and it's kind of like we have to build new things for ourselves, and that can be extremely scary in doing it, and we have to do it knowing that like we don't know the outcomes, that there's not enough precedent for us to be comfortable in making the decisions that we make, because we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. And like the extreme responses to that fear are natural. They're things that we need to work through and deal with. But like maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to get scared, not knowing what the outcome of our decisions could be, because they just feel so completely unprecedented in that way. So it just, like this novel came out deep into the shit. But it certainly wasn't written deep into the shit. So it's a really fucking weird way to leave an episode, but that's kind of where it is. And like a tidbit that I didn't really get to in the novel, and I just kind of found this out today from a podcast. It was gender reveal. Of course it was. Of course it fucking was. Is that like the term T for T itself came out of like the or at least is hypothesized to have come out of like the Craigslist personal section. Like it evolved into like a category, it was a thing, and so it came out of there. But apparently, and I'm gonna have to roll this into a later video where I just talk about, because I do want to do like a video where I just like talk about T for T, and I'm going to talk about anavalens again when I do that. But apparently the way that it really started to cross over into being like a term that we use a lot is that Torrey Peters got a T for T tattoo in 2016, and that really like jump-started like the adoption of it as a phrase. And I find that like I just couldn't stop smiling, because it's just like I just finished reading this book, and so I kind of have like some sense of like an imprint of her like influence in my life now, because I've read her novel. And I was just like, wow, check that out. I get that reference. I know who that person is. I read her book. And that's just kind of like the final irony of the book, that of course like the relationship at the center of the novel that that dissolves awfully and terribly and heartbreakingly, and just in a really just shattering way, is a T for T relationship. And just the fact that like none of the really like super elaborated on like really sexy like sex stuff that like happens in the book is T for T. Like that there is that going on, but that's never like the sex that really gets explored in terms of like discussing specific instances and scenes of it. And so it's just like, why don't we get why don't we get more of that? Like we have the post-coital conversations, or like the like dissolution conversations, but it's just why don't I get this? Give me more candy, give me more dessert in my novel. Like I want 2 helpings of dessert, not just 1. But then it's just kind of like, I was like, oh yeah, that's like my job, right? And I've talked about before how like I really love seeing stuff, and then this was a real comics thing for me specifically, but I'm seeing it elsewhere now too. But it was just kind of like when I was looking around, I was thinking, these are the trans comics that I want to do, because these are the conversations I don't see people turning into comics or like see in media. And I looked around, I was like, what are the other dolls doing in comics? And they're doing things that are wildly different from what I'm doing. And I was like, I love the plethora of things that everybody else is doing, and just giving me the freedom to just do what the fuck I do, because I don't have to worry about comparing myself to you. It's not like, oh my goodness, is what I'm about to do not desirable or popular enough to work? Should I copy somebody else? It was like, no, they're doing all these amazing things, and I can do something that's completely fucking different. So that's just how my mindset has just changed around the whole competition of just like competition and jealousy within like marginalized communities and like other creative trans women in particular. So it's just kind of like, I was like, Torrey Peters, you did not give me enough like hot stuff in the T for T section. And then I was like, but that's my job. That's my job. That's what I do. And that's what I'm gonna fucking do.